The Mahabharata, in my opinion, is the record of a historical fact, but much embellished. So there is a fairly short report on it, direct by eyewitnesses, and then poets have worked on it and added to it continuously for about 1,000 years, so that it has become a very, very large epic with a number of philosophical excursions, with a few miracle stories, with stories unrelated to the main story, but where the main story nevertheless recognizably still reports on a real historical event. And that historical event must have taken place in the second millennium before Christ.
Yeah. The way I look at Mahabharat, especially when it began because of my interest in Bhagavad Gita. And then when I first came across Mahabharat, I was skeptical whether it's a history or not. But I said, in a scientific fashion, things can be assumed without supposing them. So let's say it is a history, and then look through the evidence. The current Mahabharata that we have, that itself talks of 4 recensions. So Vyasa is telling it to Vaishampayan, Vaishampayan is telling it to Janmejay, and then Janmejay, that conversation is being listened to by Sauti, yes, and then he's writing it. So I started with a specific observation in Mahabharata, and that I found very intriguing, and it sort of gave me that nice crux. Unless I find a empirical proof for that observation, I said I'm not going to worry about dating Mahabharata or knowing more about Mahabharata. That was this Arundhati Vasishtha observation from Bhishma Parva, and I came across it in 1995, and then it took me 15 years before I solved the mystery of that observation. And so based on that, the conclusion of that observation, one single observation, was that if that observation is true, then Mahabharat war did not happen even a day late than 4508 BCE. I mean, it can be said with that extreme mathematical certainty.
Well, I disagree. I disagree. First of all, the narrative in the Mahabharata itself about these 2 stars, they are double stars, is that the appearance of Alcor or Arundhati before Mizar or Vasishtha is an abnormality. It is a sign of something special. Now, in the age which you say, 4,000 something, and the millennia before that, it was not an abnormality. That's precisely when it was normal. But it is in more recent years, since 4,500 something BC, that it is Vasishtha that comes first, and then it becomes meaningful to treat as an abnormality the earlier rising of Arundhati. Frankly, I have no theory to what phenomenon this text is referring, but I know from a whole lot of other evidence that 4,500 BC or even 3,139 BC, as very many Hindu traditionalists say, that these both are impossible.
Okay, I'm glad Dr. Elst said that he doesn't have his theory of his own for this, and that's very important. I do have a theory of my own, and so if you have to think in a scientific fashion, you think of the 3 triangles: explanation, prediction, and testing. So explanation of Mahabharata is Vyas before the war begins, just a day before. He states that Arundhati is walking ahead of Vasishtha. Now there are 2 aspects to it. One is the omen aspects, that what Dr. Elst or even Sri Srikant Talagiri seems to emphasize. That can be a theory by itself, but my theory is just a pure theory of astronomy evidence. So the second aspect is what you mentioned about the Vasishtha, they being a double star and so on. None of this comes into the evidence that I'm talking. They are double stars, we are not denying on that. But probably you are not aware of the enigma around this observation. I'll quickly summarize. There are more than 130 different Mahabharata researchers who have come up with those many different dates. And they range from 500 BC
Yes.
all the way to 7300 BC. And out of that, only four researchers mentioned this Arundhati Vasishtha observation. And two of them, Bharatacharya C.V. Vaidya or Bharat Ratna Pandurang Vaman Kane, they found it impossible astronomically. They said this is something impossible in the very order of nature, and somebody must have inserted it afterwards. So it was the enigma. So when Dr. Elst says, oh, that's obvious, Arundhati was walking ahead of Vasishtha before 4500, it wasn't obvious until I discovered it in 2009.
Well, it was obvious to the people in those days who were watching the stars at night. You see, they saw Arundhati rise before Vasishtha, if they had sharp eyes, because not everyone can see it.
And that is precisely the point, that they were making an observation, and Vyas did see Arundhati walk ahead of Vasishtha. In fact, that's the deductive logic I'm putting together. Explanation, Arundhati walking ahead of Vasishtha. We couldn't test it until 2009. When we did test it, the conclusion was, if that statement of Mahabharata text is true, then Mahabharat war happened sometime before 4500 08 BC and sometime after 11091 BC.
Yeah. Right, I perfectly understand. Now you see.
Now, by the way, thank you, because many don't understand that.
Now you see, the problem with all these daters of the Mahabharata is that they always pick one thing, one passage, and then deduce everything from that. Now you see, in this case, you see this astronomical fact is in conflict with a number of other astronomical facts, and you can concentrate on those and say, no, the chronology is 2000 BC or something else, and then say, this is definitively proven because this astronomical fact, this is certain.
Excellent. I mean, again, Doctor, you are referring to a very good problem that exists in this area of Mahabharata research. Out of 130, more than 60 researchers claim that they have used this astronomy evidence to come at this date. And to your point, they are coming with 60 different dates. And how do we solve this problem? And common man really finds it confusing. So I started with one observation. The point is, you don't stop there. So anytime you test another observation, in theory, it is a attempt to make your hypothesis fail. So just to summarize, so I looked at Mahabharata text and identified every single astronomy observation I could find. I have found 215, and I put it 215 plus because there would be more. And if any new observation is found, it should be tested against my theory, and in theory it can falsify my theory. But to answer your question, so out of these 215 observations, with the exception of 4 or 5 observations, and I have written a separate chapter in my book called Conflicting Observations. So if you want to use the analogy of a tennis tournament or tennis match, I would say 215 the total points, and the score for my theory, my proposal, stand at something like 210 to 5. And we can talk about those specific 5 too. So, if you think there is a specific astronomy evidence that conflicts with my theory, you may raise it, and I will be very happy to respond to that.
Okay. Well, there may be several, but one is really important. It is the position of the star Regulus or Magha. Several times in the Mahabharata, Bhishma predicts, then Bhishma posits as a condition for Yudhishthira to come and visit him on his deathbed. Then it is described by the narrator when he actually dies, that all this is happening when there are 2 markers for time given. When it is after Uttarayana, after the winter solstice, and when it is the month of Magha.
Very good.
That is to say, it implies that the asterism around the star Magha has passed the solstice axis. Now, we know when that star was on the solstice axis, which is in 2300 BC. And so, you see, if it is 10 degrees after that, that corresponds to 710 years. If it is 15, you see, to a few centuries more. But at any rate, it is sometime after 2300 BC.
Okay.
For example, in 1500 BC.
Okay, excellent. So, Dr. Elst, you mentioned that many researchers simply take one observation and make a case for it, just like you thought I made just with the Arundhati Vasishtha observation. Well, what you just did, that Magha observation with respect to the Bhishma, is actually one of the 23 specific observations in the context of Bhishma Nirvana. One of the 23. Yeah. So, I will come back to explain how that can be explained, Magha. And so your time period is correct. If we take Magha, then actually it comes to 1800 BC. Magha Shukla Ashtami, if you take that as the day of Bhishma Nirvana. So 1800 BC, we are in agreement on that. But here is the problem. If you look at the chronology of Bhishma Nirvana, beginning with Bhishma Purva, where he fell down in the battle on the 10th day of the war, then Drona Purva, Karna Purva, Shalya Purva, Sauptik Purva, Stri Purva, Shanti Purva and Anushasan Purva. So if you go through the chronological sequence, what you find is this. Additional 9 days, total of 18 days of the war. So after that, so 9 days Bhishma is on the bed of arrows during the war itself. Yes. Then they did the cremation rites for all the dead people. And then Yudhishthir, Dhritarashtra, they left for the bank of Ganga. And Vaishampayan states that they lived there for a month. So, Vinayak, if you want to do the addition there, so 9 plus 27 to 30 days, somewhere between that. I'm conservatively taking only 27. Then the Dhritarashtra and Yudhishthir came back to Hastinapur. Yudhishthir was crowned as a king. And then Krishna tells Yudhishthir to let's go and meet Bhishma. When they do that, Krishna states to Bhishma that Bhishma had 56 more days to live. Pachashatam shatcha kuru pravira shesham dinanam tava jivitasya. So if you just do the addition, 9 plus 27, I'm taking the most conservative number, plus 56, that gives you 92 plus X days, because we don't know some of the days. Now what is the significance of that? We also know that the war began based on Bhishma references, Bhishma Parva references, that it definitely began after Kartik month was over, because there is a mention to Kartik full moon, Kartik Krishna Chaturdashi. So the earliest Bhishma could fall in the battle is Margashirsha Shukla 9, earliest. It could be later. Do you agree?
I don't immediately get the connection. I know that it all depends on, you see, when you date it precisely, on that depends when the Kartika month falls.
Correct, correct.
Yes.
But we are just going by the description
anyway,
right now. Yeah.
You know, complete your argument.
So Margashirsha Shukla 9, what happens interestingly, in our times, right now is the month of Margashirsha. Yeah. In our times, Margashirsha Shukla 9, not every year, because it's a lunar month, matches with the day of winter solstice. Yeah. So suppose Mahabharata happened in our time, we would have said Bhishma was on the bed of arrows for 0 days, or actually negative days. But the Bhishma, the Mahabharata sequence tells us that he was on the bed of arrows for a minimum of 92 days. Yeah. And this point of winter solstice shifts every 72 years by 1 degree or 1 tithi, 1 median tithi. So if you do a quick calculation, so 90 times 70, so that's like we're talking 6,000 plus years, and then separate the 2,000 years of our era. So we are looking at 4,000 BC or before, just on this calculation. Nothing to involve with Arundhati Vasishtha. So there are two different sets of references in Mahabharata that leads to the same conclusion.
Well, I don't think so, because the month of Kartika itself moves, with the precession.
Yes.
And so if you go back to 4000 BC, it already falls too early. And a number of things that happen during that month would fall in summer, when the text itself says that they fall in autumn. And if the death of Bhishma falls on the 8th day after winter solstice, which is a very tight supposition because it can also be on the 10th or the 12th or whatever. It is not said by him when this month starts after the winter solstice. So it may be even more, but okay, let's take 8 days. Well, then you are about, in present day Gregorian terms, if the winter solstice falls on 21st of December, then your death of Bhishma falls around the 1st of January. 92 days before that is the end of September, which is indeed in autumn. You see, and this is where Kartika falls in the second millennium BC.
Okay, let me stop you because you misrepresented what I said. I did not say that Bhishma passed 8 days after the day of winter solstice. What I said, many of the researchers specifically think of a specific tithi. They say Magha Shukla Ashtami. I am not saying I agree with them. In fact, let's move the tithi away. We both agree that the day has to be a day of winter solstice or a day after. There is no evidence, as you said correctly, to assume that Bhishma waited that long. But my point is, and again, this is something I'm writing a book on, the whole book on Bhishma Nirvan, and that's something I can explain in 20 minutes. So, but again, things can be assumed without supposing them. So if that argument can be technically put, and if astronomers agree with it, would you agree with it?
Well, that depends on how well informed those astronomers are.
Okay.
I mean, like, for instance, for myself, I have to take the limitation into account that I don't know the whole Mahabharata. I see there are many passages that I haven't read. I have specifically gone through the historically relevant passages, at least that I know to be historically relevant, because who knows what secrets are hiding in the rest.
Yes.
Then you see also there is a time lapse in the sense that I used to work heavily on that, now not so much anymore. But nevertheless, the argument about Regulus, about Magha, that I think is entirely certain. And then you see what I've more recently paid attention to is the non-astronomical evidence. And there you see, you come across facts that astronomers don't think of and don't take into account. And so here you have a number of archaeological facts. As you know, there was a conference on the Indraprastha on a particular part of Delhi that was founded by the Pandavas. And so much of it was really about the chronology of the Mahabharata. None of the professors there defended the classical date of 3000 something BC. Only one, but it was not a classical date, it was based on astronomy also. This was Narahari Achar, who defended 3067, which is not a classical date. And no one at all defended a date before the classical date. Now, B. Bilal, the nonagenarian dean of Indian astrology, he still comes to new insights. He still had a lot to offer, and so he opted for a low date of 1000 BC or so, on the basis of probably, in my opinion, a too low estimate of the duration of one king's term in power, which he thinks is 13 years. Evidence from European dynasties suggests more that it's 20 years. So that would make for a few centuries earlier. But at any rate, much, much later than the classical date. Why? Because of a number of reasons. In the dynastic lists as given in the Puranas and so on, you have 1000 and a few years between Parikshit's coronation, the grandson of Arjuna, and the coronation of Mahapadmananda in 386 before Christ. So you end up in about 1400 BC. He gave a few more elements from dynastic lists involving the drowning of Hastinapura in 800 BC, the synchronism between one of the descendants with the Buddha and so on. Anyway, those details I won't go into. But you see, the main fact that he gave, and as an archaeologist he's quite competent to give it, and all the archaeologists there agreed, none of the places mentioned in the Mahabharata, not Indraprastha, not Sonipat, not Hastinapura, not Dwarka, existed at all in 3000 BC, let alone earlier. You see, he pointed out that, you know, when you go dig in Indraprastha, for instance, you end up in the 2nd millennium, and now maybe the village already existed, and only later did they consecrate it into Indraprastha, perhaps. In that case it would be even later, but you see, if they themselves started building from scratch, then you see it is not older than, let's say, 1500 BC.
Okay, and that was because they were digging in the wrong places. See, the area of archaeology is a very interesting area, and so 2 points you mentioned. One is Professor Achar. So let me mention that Professor Achar, I sent a book when I published in 2011. I sent it also PDF copy to you, and I sent it to every single Mahabharat researcher I knew, and I heard from maybe 2 or 3 out of 50 plus that I sent. I never heard from Professor Achar, but recently one Shri Prabhakar Fadnis, very persistently he kept on communicating with Professor Achar, and he's also at our Waves conference. Yes. And finally, very reluctantly, Professor Achar agreed that the force of Arundhati Vasishtha observation cannot be denied, and I wrote a blog article on it. So that is his conclusion. I mean, finally he has to agree. But let's get back to Professor B.B. Lal. What he has done, Professor B.B. Lal, is tremendous work on archaeology. He should also be credited for starting with the AIT in his early days, and when sufficient evidence came contrary to it, to change that position. And that happens only in science. The problem I see for his archaeological work is this. The archaeological evidence by itself is impeccable, no issues. So he did some digging at Hastinapur in UP, and also he looked at Kurukshetra and some other Mathura and so many places. What they did find, and Dr. Elst is correct, that when they went down to 2000 BC, nothing below that, and that's what I'm saying. They must be digging at the wrong place. But I'll come back to that. What kind of evidence, even if we find it, that we are looking for that matches with Mahabharat war? Because we have to look at the descriptions from the Mahabharat text and then do the comparison with what they find. And this is what they found in Hastinapur. They found the what they call scratched grey pottery, also polished, new or something like that, modern polished grey pottery or something like this. So essentially they dug in one place that they thought was Hastinapur.
Do you mean painted grey?
Painted grey, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. PGW, painted grey ware, and then there is a northern black polished pottery. And what they found is at certain layers, like 1000 BC or 800 BC, there is this pottery. So far so good, archaeologically great stuff. Here is the problem now. All that archaeology tells us is that 800 BC or 1000 BC, 1600 BC, whatever that time frame is, some people who lived at that site who happened to use that PGW pottery by itself has nothing, I say nada, to do with Mahabharat war or Mahabharat time frame.
Yes, he of course said emphatically that he assumes that the painted grey ware is typical for the culture and the generation of the Mahabharata, thereabouts. But, you know, at any rate, you see there are different layers at the site, but none of them predates 2000 BC.
The last part I agree, that the sites that he dug, none of them go beyond 2000 BC. To the first claim that you are quoting from B.B. Lal, that the grey pottery or clay pottery matches with Mahabharat text, there is, let me tell for the viewers and for your information, there is no evidence whatsoever anywhere in the Mahabharat text that will allow us to say, there is a mention of this certain pottery and that we can connect with the Mahabharat time.
Yes, but here there is a strong suspicion of a special pleading, which is that you posit a very unlikely scenario, namely that all these archaeologists, after consulting the Mahabharata information on the location of the site, nevertheless in every single case went to dig at the wrong site. You know, add to that, you know, there are similar other cases, like a similar argument had been used when B.B. Lal had been digging in Ayodhya. And so there, much to the dismay of the secularist historians, He found the remains of a temple underneath the mosque. He found the pillar bases, but much to the dismay of the traditionalists, he also found that at some point it stops. And you see, those traditionalists spoke of 7000 BC for Rama or some other very early date before the Mahabharata, which they date to the 32nd century BC. And so you see, the human material at that site did not go that far. And I know many of the sons and the acharyas and so on protested heavily, booed him off the stage, and he answered, well, you know, if you really have such problems with it, strictly speaking, it is not me who says it, it is my spade that says it.
Yeah.
And you know, I find this a general pattern that people defending high chronologies, that when archaeology cannot confirm that, high chronology, said I?
Yes.
Yeah. So when archaeology does not confirm that, then they suddenly say, oh yeah, but this time archaeology is not good, they were digging at the wrong site.
Okay.
You see, this is possible, of course. It is against, you know, Occam's razor. You know, you have to take the most plausible solution. Well, sometimes you don't. Sometimes the truth is indeed complicated and surprising. However, I'd like to see supportive evidence for that.
Very good. I'm glad you recognize that. And the typical problem that archaeologists have, especially taking archaeological data and connecting it with a specific epic period around the world, is basically the problem we call absence of evidence is equal to evidence of absence. Now, glad you recognize that in future we may find it.
Yeah.
And but right now, if you look at all the archaeological available evidence, this is what we can say. There is no archaeological evidence that is been found that will support the Mahabharata timing, because it has to match at some descriptions. We finding so I was giving a talk in Mumbai, and similar question comes. In fact, it's a frequently asked question. And somebody says, but what about archaeological data? And I said, what kind of data are you looking for? Suppose for a minute, somebody digs to a certain layer, doesn't matter what it is, and finds a bow and arrow, and for a hypothetically speaking, let's say the Arjuna's Dhanusha name, the Gandiva, is written on it. Even it says this is Arjuna's Dhanusha, let's say. Is it going to convince anybody? Doesn't matter what timeline. In fact, it will raise more suspicion than actually convince us.
Yeah.
So my summary on the archaeological data is we don't have any evidence that negates or supports Mahabharata war.
Well, I am only starting with the archaeological evidence.
Very good.
You see, there are other types of evidence than the digging at those sites.
Please.
One is is events that happened later at those sites, like the drowning, the submergence of Dwarka, is still mentioned in the epic, and that has been archaeologically dated to about 1400 BC. Then an entirely different type of archaeological argument concerns the river Saraswati, which has been found archaeologically and geologically to have dried up in 1900 BC. Now, the Mahabharata itself has some data pertinent to the Saraswati. You have Bhima going to the northwest and crossing all the rivers, and whatever he makes of the Saraswati is not the large stream, still ocean going, it is said, described in the Rig Veda. No, on the contrary, the desiccation of the Saraswati clearly had taken place already. And it is even more explicitly implied in the pilgrimage that Balarama undertakes to the Saraswati, where he goes up to the disappearing point of the Saraswati in the Rajasthan desert. So at that time it was already so weak a river, so little a river, that it couldn't stand the heat and it dried up in the desert.
Excellent.
So that was after 1900 BC.
All right. So Dr. Elst makes here 2 points. One is about the Dwarka, the flooding and destruction of Dwarka, and the second is the state of Saraswati during the Mahabharata war. So let me, bit broad, but let me give the answer to the Dwarka. He quoted a specific record of flooding near Dwarka in around 1400 or 1500 BC. Again, this is the interesting problem of taking a data. I'm not disputing a flood record around Dwarka in 1500 BC. Actually, I'm aware of it. But there could be many floods. But you cannot just randomly, and you haven't done that, but you cannot just take one random flood and say because flood happened, and we also knew there was a flood in Dwarka, therefore Mahabharat war happened here, right? Now, think of the astronomy evidence that I used, and I won't go into all the details, but 215 plus specific observations. The specific year that I proposed, originally proposed by Dr. P.V. Vartak, 5561 BC, 5561 BC. And Mahabharat text has a record that Dwarka was destroyed 36 years after the war. So that comes to 5525 BC. So there is one independent prediction, right or wrong, from the astronomy for 5525 BC. Now, just like you said, based on some other evidence, 1400 BC was there, and you found also Dwarka evidence. Yes. Let me give you the flood and destruction evidence for Dwarka. If you see in the Arabian Ocean, there is a 25 plus meter rise of water in 6 millennium BC, right in the middle of 6 millennium BC, and I have the data. Now, when you go around the world, not just west coast of India, go around the world, there's tons of data. In fact, I started researching it, and after getting my 50th data point, I stopped. I said I had enough of it. For example, as far as Barbados, there is a 6.5 meter sudden rise in 5600 BCE, plus minus 130 years. If you know the formation of the Black Sea that we have today, the salty Black Sea, the time period, you'll be surprised, it is again 5525 BC, plus minus 30, 40, 50 years, that accurate. If you come to the west coast of India, there is a seismology record from what do you call, National Oceanography Institute, or some of them but in the south, not Goa. And I was actually amazed that you could have a seismology records in the geological data, because I would imagine they will get destroyed. So they have one going backwards and a significant big earthquakes. They have one record around 2700 BCE. But the another one going further back is again 75,000 years, which is again 5500 BCE. And the Richter scale was like a very high, like a 7 Richter scale. If you have seen the Graham Hancock, Glenn Milne documentary, that island in the ocean that just disappeared, and that was right at that time, 6th millennium BCE. So that's just for the Dwarka. Now, I want to understand, it's only corroborative evidence. That by itself doesn't prove anything. But when you have a date independently arrived from another science like astronomy, and then now we have a corroborative evidence, supporting evidence from another field like geology, or oceanography, whatever you want to call it, that is a very solid evidence. Now let me talk on the Saraswati. I agree with you, again, no need to dispute that sometime around 1900 BC, you have said that before, that Saraswati disappeared. Saraswati completely disappeared. And therefore you say it has to be after 1900 BC, is that correct? Yes. Okay. Now here is a problem with that argument, because if you look at all the references of Saraswati from the Mahabharata, it is a very mixed state. As you said correctly, at many places it has disappeared under the sand, and Balaram mentions that. But then there are also many places where it is flowing very nicely. Sometimes it is flowing underground, and I have all references in my book. And at one places where Balaram is doing the Tirtha Yatra, he actually talks of Saraswati turning east. And the beautiful broad view, and he was dismayed. I mean, he was amazed to see that broad view. So definitely Saraswati was in a very what you call mixed, turbulent state there. Some places it has disappeared, some places it has not disappeared. Now I also want to quickly agree with the other point you said, that the grand Saraswati of Rigveda is not the Saraswati in Mahabharata time. I agree. In fact, it's not the Saraswati of Ramayan times. And Dr. Elst calls me or many others, and I like that title, by the way, high chronology enthusiast. I love it, you know, I really love it. In fact, the time I have come up with for the Ramayan is 12,209 BCE. All right. So you are going to fall off your chair, so let me hold it. Okay. That's 13 millennium BCE. And even the Ramayan mentions that Satluj has already turned west. because that was the river that fed Saraswati.
Yeah.
And Yamuna, which also fed Saraswati, has already turned east and is meeting Ganga, even in Ramayan times. So we are the grand Saraswati of Rigveda. We have to go even further back in the high chronology area beyond 13 millennium BCE.
Yeah, well, I can think of a more down-to-earth way of explaining those things. So we can talk about the Ramayana if the need arises. But as for Dwarka, you see, the archaeological discovery of a submergence in 1400 BC is still there.
Yes.
And so whatever may have happened in 6000 something BC, you see, I agree that worldwide, the end of the Ice Age was punctuated by a number of floods worldwide and testified to in mythologies worldwide.
Yes.
But, this is probably not what happened in Dwarka. We have a description of Dwarka's submergence, but not of other coastal cities at the same time. And so, in my opinion, what happened in Dwarka was of a different nature than these floods as a consequence of the rise of the sea level.
Okay, well, you said we don't have a descriptions of what happened around the world, and I agree. But in a scientific framework, we must agree to it that we can only talk of the evidence that we have. We cannot talk of the evidence that we don't have.
Well, what evidence we have is that people in already quite a few places did write, and you see writers in Phoenicia or in Egypt or so didn't notice a sudden rise of the sea level by 25 meters. Now, of course, you could say, that is because there the writing that we have is not that old. You see, maybe such a flood happened in the Mediterranean also, only it happened before writing there, and they didn't have the mnemotechnical means of the Vedic people to preserve information for thousands of years by learning it by heart. Who knows, you could say that.
Yeah, I mean, that could be, but I'm not saying that. I mean, that's not my even argument. I'm only talking of the evidence that we have.
Yeah.
But you have some other objections. For example, you have talked about the chariots.
Exactly, that's where I was coming to.
Very good.
You see, 5000 something BC is all very nice, I'm all for it, but you see, some factual arguments plead against it. Now let's say first, you have to distinguish in a historical narrative that old between the core of the narrative, which is really about the facts that happened, and then all the things that were woven around it. And then very often later editors project onto the past the living circumstances of their own day. Like, for example, perhaps the Ramayana was very old. We see the main characters depicted, Rama with a bow and arrow, Hanuman even with a mace. These are prehistoric weapons. You see, they're not depicted with bronze swords or iron swords, shields, whatever. And of course later, you see in some scenes of the Ramayana, you do get more evolved weaponry, but those can easily have been fantasized or, you see, composed later. And similarly in the Mahabharata, a distinction may be made between the core story and later. However, the chariot battle is absolutely the core of the Mahabharata, and Krishna is there as a charioteer, and Karna is killed because his chariot falls apart. And so we therefore have to ask, when did chariots exist? The oldest chariot found is 2200 BC, it's in Russia. Not so much because in Russia they invented it, but because the Indian climate is not very conducive to the preservation of wooden implements.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, we know the high tide of chariot warfare was in the second half of the second millennium. We see, for instance, the War of Troy. Let me make an aside, by the way, the War of Troy and the story, the epic about Troy by Homer, in the 19th century, when they were all very critical, you see, they didn't believe this was historical. Until an amateur started digging, Heinrich Schliemann, and he found it to be historical. Then later the Hittite language was discovered. Certain names among the Trojans turned out to be Hittite and so on. So it turned out to be quite historic in the core. Because of course there are also embellished stories later on. You know, it had 500 years time to grow. Anyway, so similarly the Mahabharata must also have a historical core. On that we can agree. Now the thing is, you know, also in that period you have the war between the Hittites and the Egyptians, which was a chariot war, 1200 something BC. You have the pursuit of Moses by the Pharaoh, 1300 BC. You have the manual of horse training in Mitanni, 1400 BC. Similarly, I mean, it is clear this is the high tide of warfare. In the first millennium, chariot warfare went out of fashion because cavalry was developed, and it was from then on more efficient, and so chariots were then only used for play, you know, ultimately for the games in the arena in Rome. So, you know, we have a specific window when chariots were used. Before that, technology was not sophisticated enough. Afterwards, technology was more sophisticated, you know, yielding easier alternatives than chariots. So, you see, by the evidence of chariots puts us clearly in the second millennium BC. In 3000 something, in the classical or the traditionalist date, there were no chariots. In 5000 there were certainly no chariots.
Okay, very good. Again, so if I can summarize your argument, that the earliest discovery, archaeologically speaking, of a chariot was in around 2300 BC in Sintasha, Russia. What does that tell us? Again, when it comes to interpretation, is that definitely a chariot existed somewhere on the earth in 2300 BC. It truly doesn't tell you anything what happened to the chariots afterwards, unless you have evidence or some description. It doesn't have to be archaeological evidence, or what happened before. And something that was in Russia, we cannot just take it and necessarily say, therefore, well, using the modern lingo, unless it happens in America, how can it be discovered, invented, improvised in India? But even, I'm not going to even go that direction. Then Dr. Elst referred to how the warfare, the chariot-based warfare continued for next 2000 years or something like this. And because there are a lot of references to that, Mahabharata war must have happened during that time. Here is like saying the couples are fighting. Well, the couples are fighting forever. That is not an argument for specifying a specific time period.
I think it is. You see, if they were fighting with nuclear weapons, you would not date them before the 20th century. You know, and so if they were using that type of weaponry, that type of technology, well, it must have been in the age when that type of technology.
Okay, but here is the problem. I mean, you will agree with this, that just because the first chariot was found in 2500 BC somewhere in Russia, are you considering that evidence as a proof that the chariots did not exist anywhere else in the world before 2500 BC?
Well, you know, that would be a negative type of proof, which we indeed don't like.
But that's what many people use it without many times knowing it, without knowing this.
Right, okay, but let's remain conscious of it. Fact is that we have many descriptions of warfare from Egypt, from Mesopotamia, from China, where, you know, all kinds of weapons are described and where the chariot is still conspicuous by its absence. Then we have the chariot, and then later we don't have the chariot anymore. So you see, everything points to the historicity of the assumption that chariots flourished in the second half of the second millennium.
Okay.
And so I wouldn't veer off too far from that assumption. You see, maybe 500 years earlier, here or there, but you see, not indefinitely, not 5000 BC.
Okay, and I want to stop on that piece of argument, but what I'll say is that what you are inferring from that is not, I mean, in my humble opinion, is not scientifically sound. Because you cannot talk of the time that you don't know. We can only talk of the evidence that we do have.
Well, history is of course not physics, I agree. You work with probabilities, and so, some postmodernists nowadays assume that there is no such thing as historical truth. I think there very much is. And historians try to reconstruct things, as Leopold von Ranke said, as they have really been, wie es wirklich gewesen ist. And so that's what we aim for, and of course we realize that we have limited evidence. It's not perfect. It is, what you would call mathematically, it is asymptotic. That is to say, it's like a curve that approaches to a straight line, perhaps never reaching it, but getting ever close. So this way our theories are getting ever closer to history as it has really been.
Yeah.
And so I think that at the moment there is very suggestive evidence at any rate for a more reasonable, or at least a more recent date of the Mahabharata war than 3000 or then 5000 BC.
Okay, so I don't understand how you jump to that conclusion, but let me tell you what I do agree with, which is the asymptotic nature from the history writing point of view. Well, that is also the approach of science. In fact, Karl Popper, Poverty of Historicism is a good book. It brings, it says social sciences and, not social sciences in the way of psychology and whatnot, in the sense of writing history, is not very different from actually science, as long as we stay with the empirical proofs. Also, some of the speculations that are made, not that there is anything wrong with speculation, so therefore this seems like it was a time of chariot battles, therefore Mahabharat war must have happened. That is like, why? And Karl Popper, not that everybody has to agree with him, but it's definitely a great thesis to look forward to, where he says, actually, any question, not just question related to history, we cannot answer why. We can speculate. But with luck, what we may be able to answer is when and where, possibly. Again, we cannot be sure. But again, the method of science is not about being 100% confident about anything. You mentioned the asymptotic solution. It is all about looking at the evidence, putting forward a theory, then doing the computation based on that theory and comparing that with the evidence and coming up with a more likely and less likely scenarios.
Yes. Yeah, well, with that, of course, I can agree. It's like the end of a research paper. You see, it typically ends with saying, in this field, more research is needed, which mostly means in this field, more financing is needed.
Well, I'll give another take on that.
Yes.
I totally agree with you. More cases, the more financing. I'll start by saying I agree with you. More financing is needed, but there is possibly another aspect to it, and it's very, very critical aspect, which is this: many times when somebody solves the problem, like when did Mahabharat war happen? So like 1500 BC, let's say you say, or many others have the different dates. Professor Achar comes to 3067 BCE. And if you ask them, all right, so you came to this conclusion, what's next? What is left to do? Are there any challenges? And I'm not sure what your answer is for that 1500 BC, because is there evidence that contradicts this 1500 BC? Obviously it does. I mean, I mentioned all the astronomy evidence, geological evidence, and so on. And of course you have your position. But when somebody uses the inductive evidence, arbitrary or selective evidence, and reaches a date, usually they say everything is explained. Whereas the additional research is required. What happens is, when you make a revolutionary discovery that leads to a revolutionary conclusion, actually it raises more problems than frankly it answers. It answers only one or two, that war did not have happened after this date. So for example, once I say 4508 BCE, many questions. I mean, they can be raised for 1500 BC too. Okay, what about the language? What about the technology? And how did they record this, all of this? Or astronomy observation, when we say in 5561 BC, Vyas is writing Arundhati ahead of Vasishtha, and seeing that as a nimitta, meaning a sign and a bad sign, which also means he was aware of a time when Arundhati was actually behind Vasishtha. I mean, these are the grand questions that are raised. And if you have to go back, we are going back 11,091 BC and before that. And then the question is, do we have evidence of it? And actually we do. I mean, we are just scratching the surface.
Well, in this case, I think we have to use our common sense. You see, it is true that the narrator who describes as an abnormal event the rise of Arundhati before Vasishta, that he was familiar with an earlier time when it did not take place,
Yes.
namely his own time. You see, he was perfectly familiar with the rise of Vasishta before Arundhati, and precisely because being used to that, he just saw that this time it didn't happen. That very night it happened differently. That is why he found it abnormal. You see, because after 5000 something BC, he was used to Vasishta rising first. Now, I don't know, again, I don't know what then exactly happened. You see, probably there is a natural explanation for this. And so that, for example, is a thing to be worth investigating. That is worth investigating.
Yeah, that is a good point. And what I would say is that your argument being the Vyas has to be there within his lifetime. He should have seen Vasishta go ahead and then Arundhati go ahead. The counterpoint I will make to that is, what if we have a long tradition of astronomy observations based on the records? For example, like today we look at the sky outside, we don't see a comet. And so somebody describes a beautiful comet to us and we say, what are you talking? We haven't seen one. But since we have records going back, we say, okay, they do occur. Say Halley's comet, you know, it does come every 77 years. What if we have astronomy tradition of observations going back into antiquity? Now, this is a hypothetical question, but it doesn't have to be a hypothetical question, because if we go into the ancient Indian records, we actually find the observations that go back. In fact, in Mahabharat, my 5th chapter in the book is the fall of Abhijit, which is Brahma Rashi or Nakshatra Vega becoming a pole star. And we know, based on modern astronomy, that that happened around 12,000 BC. So Mahabharat text, whatever the time that anybody wants to assign to it, is recording a reference of Brahma Rashi, Abhijit or Vega becoming a pole star. So we have a tradition of astronomy observations going back into long into antiquity, and frankly my work has taken it to up to 26,000 years. The challenge is then the whole cycle repeats, the cycle of precession of equinoxes, and I found that as a limit. And there is another researcher in Gujarat, Miss Rupa Bhatti, and she's actually working on the Agastya references, and that takes it, that allows us to go beyond 26,000 BC. So we have a long tradition.
Well, one counterexample is in the Maitri Upanishad, where a number of signs of decadence and decay are given, and one of them is from the natural world, namely the falling away of the pole star from the pole. Now, the star Tuban in 2700 BC, you know, fell on the North Pole, and then gradually it removed itself from it because of the precession. Now, what is said there in the Upanishad is a recording of this movement away from the pole. So they did notice the phenomenon of precession, but they didn't understand it yet. They thought it was chaos, when in fact it was the application of a natural law, only a more difficult to discover natural law, namely the phenomenon of the precession. So, but then I'll answer that myself. You could say, well, you see, maybe at that time and at that place they didn't understand the precession. This does not exclude that in a very big country like India, in some other place, perhaps at some other time, they did understand it, and they did keep long time records, so that they did understand these long time phenomena, which is possible.
Yeah. Well, I did not know that, which Upanishad did you say?
Maitri.
Maitri Upanishad had this falling off of Thuban and coming back. So thank you for that new reference, and I'll consult that. But I do not understand why that is a counter to what I said. I am not stating anywhere. In reality, they may know or they may not know about the phenomenon of precession of equinoxes. In fact, my theory in the dating of Ramayana, but also Mahabharat, is simply that of all the astronomy observations of the Mahabharata and Ramayana text are factual, visual observations of the sky. So they may understand the phenomenon, why it happened, why it did not happen. They're simply noticing it and recording it.
Yeah, there, of course, you mentioned the historicity of the Ramayana. You know, about that in the time of the Ayodhya controversy, of course, secularists would have laughed you out of court, saying, of course, this is a story, there's nothing to do with history. Now there, it has a little bit less to do with history. You know, a wife being abducted and recovered is something that has happened many times in history. You know, this could have happened at any time and at many places. So in this case, and it also concerns far fewer people than the Mahabharata, which is a whole array of personalities involved. Many of them present in the dynastic lists given in the Puranas. Now, in the case of Rama, of course, you have his own place in the dynastic lists. So, you know, you can estimate that he was in the late Vedic period, not very much in contact with the Vedic world because there was a certain geographical distance, but at least datable roughly, and certainly in relative terms. You know, you can more or less synchronize him with the Vedas, whereas the Mahabharata is just after the end of the Vedas, when the Vedas have been completed, you know, symbolically by Vyasa. So, you know, the Veda, the Ramayana is more loosely dated, but at least Rama can be dated, if at all, of course, those dynastic lists are not pure fantasy. And many people will say it's pure fantasy. Personally, I don't think so. You have a number of different versions of those dynastic lists, which are a little bit different, which proves that they are genuine, but yet also largely convergent, which proves that they're talking about the same historical event. And so, you see, sometimes it is said that Indians are not good at history at all. This is largely true if you compare with China, where every date after 800 BC is precisely known, the date of every event. You see, this is not at all the case in India. Nevertheless, those dynastic lists give a history going back to much before the onset of writing. So it doesn't give anything precise, but at least it gives an idea of what happened 2, 3, 4,000 BC, which I think is impressive. And so in that vague extent, you can say the core, at least the core of the Ramayana, you know, can be dated in the time of Rama, which is in the Vedic period. Then, of course, we can discuss when was the Vedic period. Right. You know, a long story. But at any rate, you know, it is legitimate to seek at least some history in all this.
Yeah, and I agree with the relative chronology that you just mentioned, which is a Vedic period, Rama closer to the Vedic period, and then Mahabharat is when the Vyasa did the compilation of Veda, and that's why you see some references there. And we just might be worth mentioning great work of Sri Srikant Talagiri, especially Rigveda, the analysis. It's a relative chronology of Srikant Talagiri. I completely agree. When he jumps into absolute chronology, I completely disagree.
Yes, he does not say 5,500.
Right. We can stop, or
we can entirely agree to disagree on this. But you know, I think we have found the right spirit to do further research.
Absolutely. And what we have done is we have put forward for people, because sometime what will happen, and I'm sure somebody wrote to you about the Arundhati Vasishta observation. That's when Dr. Elst responded to it on your blog, I think. Yes. And what I did is I took his write-up and responded to your blog. I'm not sure if you had a chance to, but in 8 different parts. Yeah. And then that is when Sri Srikant Talagiri jumped in support of Dr. Elst, and that was good. And then actually it was great, because he jumped in, he improvised on the theory on, let's say, that side of the story, and then I took on that and I wrote another 8 series blog on what the argument Srikant Talagiri was putting forward. Unfortunately, he never responded to that after that. So thank you very much. I mean, that was great. By the way, apart from this Mahabharata debate, I am reading your work for a long time, and I'm a fan. I cannot claim I understand everything that you write, But
It's not all science.
that's right. That may be the reason, you know. But I definitely enjoy, and also your blog sometime, and we are connected on the Facebook, so I do see tidbits and all of that.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you, and it was a great pleasure to meet you in person.